Welcome to today's episode of EarthTech Roundup, where we talk about the latest trends and insights in water, nature, and climate technology. Today, we have my colleague and Earth Finance's Earth scientist, Annie Britton. She comes by way of the Climate Engine acquisition and has previously worked at NASA, NOAA, and Johns Hopkins Hydroclimate Research Group on projects ranging from drought prediction using machine learning to assessing public health impacts of extreme weather. It's great to have you here today, Annie. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about geospatial analytics, which is core to Annie's work and why it's so important in the climate space.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Kat, and excited to talk about everything Earth Finance Geospatial today.
So to start, Annie, let's dive into first defining what geospatial analytics is, and then would love to hear about what your role and your day-to-day looks like within that.
Absolutely. So I like to think of geospatial analytics is all about thinking about things in space across the globe. Um, Geospatial analytics, traditionally, I think people think a lot about climate, weather, or science data. Obviously, that's kind of the role I'm in. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. There are things like infrastructure that are highly reliant on geospatial analytics, urban planning. So it's a really broad category, but basically, you can think of it as looking at data related to where things actually are. So when it comes to my day-to-day job, I'm mostly focused on looking at earth science data in that capacity. So predominantly water data, biodiversity data, and climate and extreme events data, and looking about across the globe, where are these things going on, and then how is it impacting the clients that we have in the work that they're doing. So whether it is facilities, commodities, where things are growing, energy, things like data centers, it's a kind of an all-encompassing complex topic, but basically you can just think of it as where are things? Where are things happening?
And you're really layering these data sets on top of each other.
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is kind of building models out of a variety of layers. So using things like weather data, facility locations, energy information, and kind of stacking these all on top of one another to get an output that's bigger than the sum of its parts and will help clients answer some questions that they have or develop some strategy that's going to be based on where things actually are happening on a map.
Awesome. And now let's think, because what you do is so cool. What does your day-to-day role look like here, especially within the performing these analytics?
Yeah, so I always like to describe my role as unicorn role because I get to be both technical and also client facing, which is not something that happens a lot in a science position. But I spend the majority of my time developing the scientific methodology for the work that we do here. So focus on those kind of three pillars: water, climate, and biodiversity, and actually coding, building out models for that. And then once kind of that big bulk of the technical work is done, my role can kind of shift and I work on actually communicating to clients like the technical science aspects of the work that we're doing, communicating the outputs, kind of doing education to help them understand what the more technical jargon means and how it applies to them, and then kind of helping them understand like what's next. So we have all this data, like, so what? What are we going to do with it? So it's kind of nice. I get to work between those two sides of the same coin. And as an applied science role, it's really kind of like the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you get to be close to the heart of the problem or the question and the client's situation.
Yeah, exactly.
I found it really illuminating when you provided examples of how geospatial data solves a problem or answers a question that no other data can. Maybe we could dive into an example of one of those kind of case studies that you've worked on.
Yeah, totally. So one of my favorite ones that I always love to talk about because I think it's just very relevant to kind of everyone's everyday life, especially if you're living in a relatively warmer place in the US, is the work that we did for SC Johnson. So SC Johnson owns Off Bug Spray, and as part of their kind of questioning about different marketing strategies, different ways to interact with consumers, and then also things like keeping shelves stocked with the correct amount of product, they came to us and asked us to develop a mosquito activity forecast. So the end part of this project was one, a consumer facing website where anyone could go in and type in their zip code and get their mosquito forecast for the next 7 days, which is something that, I think especially people who regularly check the weather, things like that, it's kind of a nice seamless follow along to something like that. But also, what SC Johnson wanted was to know by zip code where mosquito activity was going to be bad so that they could do things like push ads, manage inventory, and do kind of other internal business workings that have nothing to do with that consumer side. And so I think where geospatial plays such an important part here is, of course, you can guess Florida in the springtime, wet season. Yeah, mosquitoes are going to be bad. But at a zip code level, where are
Yeah.
they going to be bad? That's where it really starts to matter for the business, because if they just know Florida, okay, well, that's not super helpful. You have to know exactly where. So that's where something like this kind of comes in to give them that business intelligence while also providing a public health aspect on the consumer side.
Yeah. I grew up in Southern California, and it makes me think about how, and when you live down there, it's for the benefit of basically eating outside all year round.
Yeah.
And my parents and their friends have started raising praying mantises to try to counteract the mosquito issue. That's how dedicated they are. And not a bug thumb or whatever you might call it to be used to feeding praying mantises, but it's such a wildly applicable solution all over the country now, and it's such a great example of something that geospatial is actually informing day-to-day business decisions, where usually inventory management, we have our other methods of lots of insights that tell us this, but it's actually coming from analytics like yours.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, traditionally they would know based off of when it generally starts, when the seasons are for somewhere like Southern California, where it's a very distinct time of year. But, that doesn't exactly tell you week to week what it's going to be. Maybe Southern California gets some crazy rainfall that it doesn't normally get, and then all of a sudden you see that. So using this was a way for them to kind of get at that more specifically rather than just the more traditional like timelines they've used.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I think of a lot of where we're headed in the next 20 years is geospatial will become more embedded in day-to-day decision making. I see a lot of it, at least in the work that I've been involved in and working with you and the team, is around how do you think about strategy setting for that mid-term or longer term time horizon, maybe 10, 20 plus years. So what about an example of how you've looked at projections of data in order to get those kinds of insights for how companies might set their strategy or select locations differently?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're totally right. One of the things we talk about a lot is the different time horizons that kind of hits at the different problems that people may have. And I think increasingly we are seeing that projections are becoming more important as people start to take climate change more seriously and really consider how they can kind of wrap that up into their business model. And so a really fun example of this, I think, is some of the commodity work that we've done for clients about projecting out not just your typical commodities like beef and corn, but more niche ones that maybe have less research around them, but are very, very important for some businesses. So examples of these would be things like coffee, vanilla, cocoa. So things that are perhaps less big and important than something like beef, but are kind of being impacted by climate change because of the highly specific environments that they grow in. So, for one of these projects, we ended up building a commodity suitability model using a host of different projections. So, we looked at climate projections for 2030 and 2050, kind of hitting that midterm range that you're kind of hinting towards across a few different scenarios. And then also looking at things like urban expansion over time, because that is something that also impacts like where things can grow.
Mhm.
Looking at how land cover and land use might change, and then other like environmental factors, even getting to something like soil pH. So it kind of mix all these things together into a model to get not only just suitability for these crops, but actually how the yields and the prices might change down the line. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, Kat, as you've kind of done the work and you've seen the outputs of this on the strategy side, how are clients reacting to something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that you're making me think about that maybe we do a part two episode with you on is the way these layers of data interact with each other is
Yeah.
really fascinating to me, and tells the story really well. And usually we do have to actually get to that level of granularity with some of our clients because that's really what tells the full picture. And it's like this aha moment. But I mean, we call it business value at risk a lot of the time, right? The outputs of this model, it's looking at how are your yields going to be changed? How is the price stability going to be changed? And that then affects all these other business activities, like the cost of trying to find a new supplier for some of our clients, they already have an estimate of what that kind of cost is for them of just those activities and the efficiencies you find with suppliers that you've had for years. You lose those, you use those things that you take for granted. So I think once we're able to put it into terms that are really have been long-standing metrics of success, it's a massively kind of expedited process in understanding. So
Yeah.
I found this to be probably the most productive way to get to this conversation and really bring a lot of these business units together.
Yeah, and I think too, you really hit on the importance is the so what of it all and what do we actually do with the outputs? Because it's great
Mhm.
to know that the price is going to change by X amount, but then it's, well, what's the next step? Do we just eat the costs or do we try to switch? And so I think kind of having the actual data to back that up and to back up the reasoning behind kind of the conversations that in some cases might already be going on is really important.
Yeah. And I think so much of what is illuminating is that differential between in an ag example or commodities, it's growing regeneratively versus growing conventionally. Or and I'd love maybe for us, because I know these are quick, snappy episodes, so we'll have to wrap up soon, but maybe we end on you have a really great energy security or energy resilience specific example, since that is obviously so top of mind for everyone right now. But that differential in what you can secure and yield, or what energy is going to be available to you when the projections are showing that it's going to be a very different picture if you don't take these actions, is really what the key is to be able to quantify.
Yeah, exactly. And I think hitting on the energy piece as well, I kind of think that on that side of things, a lot of the work that we do, whether it be projections or looking near term or even looking historically, is kind of helping do a little detective work to see, okay, what's going to be viable, what's happened in the past, and what makes sense to change. So, a nice example of this was we worked with a client who had facility level emissions data over the past few years, and they saw some strange increases in the emissions. They weren't exactly sure why it was happening across a variety of facilities, but one of the main kind of questions that they had was, is this related to extreme weather? So things like cold waves or heat waves, where you're going to be having a lot more HVAC emissions to heat or cool the stores. And so what we were actually able to do is pull heating and cooling days historically for every facility in their portfolio, which was in the thousands, and basically compare to say, is there a correlation between these higher than average emissions and the heating and cooling days for this facility over that year? In some cases, yes, there were, and in others, wasn't a correlation. So, for those where maybe we don't have that answer, we go back and we say, okay, well, then what's actually happening? If it's not
Mm.
related to the weather, what's the underlying cause? So again, that's kind of this spatial relationship that without that historical weather data, you would really not be able to parse. So it's kind of nice to be able to help do that detective work on a spatial level and start to give people answers to questions that they're not able to answer otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I so enjoy the work and working with you. So hopefully we can also get you on here again to kind of dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah, of course. I'd love to. I'll come back anytime.
Thanks, Annie.
All right. Thanks, Kat. Bye.